Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today I am frankly jumping on some recent drama that happened yesterday on the Joe Rogan Experience, because it's frankly a mainstream conversation that has effectively caused quite a few rifts in the online right. And it's part of the reason I'm very disillusioned with the online right at the moment. People who watch my streams religiously will know that I have been rather disappointed with the online right, and I have absolutely no reason to think that they are going to get anywhere near the mainstream. Yes, you can argue that Donald Trump is their way to the mainstream. Unfortunately, given the whole tariff business, I think they've shot themselves in the foot now again, despite the fact they're still defending it. Despite some upticks in the stock market, I am still seeing people saying that they have lost thousands of dollars in their portfolios, and they're probably never going to vote Trump again, so well done there. Yes, you may have got China to kowtow, but at what cost? Anyway, I'm not particularly here to talk about that. I'm here to talk about the Douglas Murray and Dave Smith chat on the Joe Rogan Experience, and I'm going to quickly go into why I feel like I need to talk about this. On the more, let's say, dork right side of the aisle, you have people like Cernovich posting clips saying, "Shitlib says Joe Rogan should have more experts on. Shitlib will not provide a definition of an expert, and it would disqualify nearly everyone in media and punditry. Expert equals person the shitlib approves of. It's not any deeper than that." Which we'll go into the clips, don't worry, we're not going to yet, but the fact that Cernovich is calling Douglas Murray a shitlib is absolutely absurd. Douglas Murray was one of the first mainstream people to effectively go absolute scorched earth on progressive liberalism. He has written multiple books on it. He has been in multiple talks on it. I remember when I was at university and the Manchester Arena got bombed, Douglas Murray seemed to be the only person consistently on panels talking about the issues with radical Islam. And now we have Cernovich coming along and calling him a progressive liberal. It's absolutely absurd that this is happening, and again, if you're not understanding my disillusion with the online right, stuff like this is why. Douglas Murray might have a good point here. He's had many good points in the past. Maybe we should listen to him, but we'll get into details of that later. Because on the other side of this argument, because Substacker Ian Horworth has said, Dave Smith versus Douglas Murray is what happens when someone who says stuff goes up against someone who knows stuff. Douglas Murray is a powerhouse, thank God he's on our side. Yes, the fracturing of the online right, or, mainstream versus online right, is becoming more and more obvious by the day. The fact of the matter is that it appears that the part of the right that can actually get stuff done, people like Douglas Murray, who, to call him a progressive liberal is absolutely ridiculous. He was at Trump's inauguration, for God's sake. And all of a sudden they want to throw him under the bus for things that he said in these clips. And again, we'll get into them, but I need you to understand the entire right-wing ecosystem at the moment is constantly fracturing. The main reason it's happening over in Britain is because of this split between very left-wing people on the right wing, your average Tory activist these days. No offence to people like Tory Rebuttal, at least he understands why things are moving right. You have then reform activists like me, who frankly want to get involved in real-world politics, and reform has been our best chance to, and part of the way you do that is by getting rid of the third faction, which is people like Cernovich, who are, for lack of a better term, are more of a screw your optics, I'm going in. And screwing your optics and going in is not a way to get any sort of serious power. The classic pushback on that is Trump got away with it. Yes, he largely did. The problem is that Trump is effectively a billionaire celebrity over in the US. We don't really have anyone like that in the UK, so you can't exactly use the exact same tactics that he used. I'm also not the only person to notice that this Smith versus Murray debate has ended up with a Rorschach test for an awful lot of people. Connor Tomlinson put out this just frankly factual and value-free commentary on Twitter. The most extraordinary exchange during Douglas Murray and Dave Smith's debate on Joe Rogan. Dave says Israel blockade is causing privation in Gaza. Douglas asks if he's ever visited Israel or Gaza, obviously to see the blockade, to which the answer was no. And Dave asks Douglas if he had visited 1930s Germany to talk about the Nazis, which, again, we'll get into the clip before we get to my commentary to it. But Connor Tomlinson then says, interesting to see comments that attribute opinions to me that I didn't offer. I just summarise what Dave and Douglas said. It's a real Rorschach test, and I'm totally on board with this too. And I'm not being funny. Connor kind of is straddling the line between being an effective real-world mainstream commentator and putting his foot in with people that are going to effectively, frankly, bring him down. And I'm not being funny, but an awful lot of people are going to be saying to that, why are you calling Dave an idiot when it's the exact same logic that Douglas is putting on him, which we'll go through my commentary soon, but that's obviously just not the case. And so with this fracturing of the right, I thought I'd just plant my flag on one side of this debate. The Rorschach test for me is, well, believe it or not, given that I've defended Douglas so far, I think Douglas is mostly right through these clips. So we may as well get into it. So let's take a look at some of the clips.
Can I ask you something?
Yes, sir.
Since the war in Israel began, and since the war in Ukraine began, you've had quite a lot of people who are very against both in different ways.
Yes.
Do you think you've had enough people on who are supportive of either war?
So this, I think, is a completely reasonable question. Whenever I see clips of Joe Rogan recently, it is very much the counter-narrative, which was never really what the Joe Rogan Experience was about. You know, Joe Rogan's had people like Brian Cox on just to talk about physics. Neil deGrasse Tyson to talk about physics, and you know, the odd time there might be a flat earther on. I don't actually know if there's been a flat earther, but yeah, when it comes to recent major political issues, it's very much largely people Rogan has got on for other reasons, but if they get on to topics like that, it's very much the counter narrative and very little pushback. And Joe Rogan isn't there to push back on things like that. That's totally fine. But Douglas Murray's point is that, well, he'll get into it in more detail, but if you have people on who are acting as some sort of authority on this, then it's probably a good idea to treat them as if they're an authority on this. You know, if you're going out there and openly making statements that will invite criticism, you're obviously going to get criticism, and it's probably a good idea to have that criticism on the show. Now, obviously, you can't force people to come on, but I will say it's part of the reason I have a policy of never deleting YouTube comments. I have a policy of very rarely banning people from my Discord. The only time I've ever banned anyone from Discord is if they're directly trying to antagonise me constantly, and even then they get fair warnings. But I do not mind people particularly coming in and spreading their nonsense, because I'm there to push back on it, obviously, when I have time. And I'm in Discords where I'm, obviously from my point of view, the lone voice of reason. A big example is the YIMBY-NIMBY debate. Douglas Murray's issue is that, well, predominantly having these people on with little or no pushback will end up with your show becoming a bit of a hug box for people with positions like that, and it will effectively not only ruin your show but ruin discourse overall, because at the end of the day, Joe Rogan has an awful lot of influence. Is he still the biggest? I think he's still the biggest podcast going, and this isn't something that Joe Rogan particularly thinks about, and all Douglas Murray is saying is perhaps it is something to think about because it's at the end of the day very important. As well as he says, I've made his point for him, but you may as well hear it from his mouth.
Let's say enough people who are on the side of Israel instead of wild critics.
Well, I've had a few. I mean, I believe Godsad is on the side of Israel.
For sure.
Jordan is on the side of Israel.
Mike Baker, Coleman Hughes.
Yeah.
Coleman did it for like 20 minutes, so it wasn't why he was here.
No, I mean, none of them is why they're here.
Yeah, and this is the thing with the Joe Rogan Experience. It is a relaxed, effectively chat between two people while they have a coffee or something. And it's what makes it really entertaining to watch, because it's usually people who aren't complete idiots talking quite deeply about subjects that, well, people may or may not be interested in. I'll listen to the Joe Rogan podcast depending on the guest. I don't listen to every one. I don't think anyone does. But if you start getting a pattern of you mainly seem to be having people who are against the war and they seem to be talking about it for hours rather than a few minutes, then yeah, you're going to build up an audience that is effectively going to capture you. How do I know this? I've seen it literally happen. God, to probably about 3 or 4 channels at this point that I was friendly with, and I've quite vehemently rejected it at every opportunity I have, to be honest with you, because, well, Frankly, I don't particularly care too much about a war that's happening on the other side of Europe, but whenever news does come out about it, I'm not being funny. But a lot of the counter-narrative seems to have way more holes in than the mainstream narrative, and when that starts happening, well, you know the alternative narrative people have got overconfident.
It's a good question.
Do you think you've tilted one way?
Me personally?
No, just with the guests you've had.
The guests, yeah, probably more tilted towards the idea that perhaps the way they've done it is barbaric.
And this is a good moment. This is Joe Rogan realising, yes, this is a decent question. Yes, I do bear quite a lot of influence over especially the American people. Perhaps it's a good idea to start thinking about these very real and current issues a bit more seriously with the guests I have on. Douglas Murray isn't saying don't have these people on, and I don't know why people are coming away with that. Douglas Murray is saying, why are the people you're bringing on, do they seem to be more one-sided? And granted, he does bring people like Gad Saad on, but even Joe Rogan himself says, you're right, the conversation does tend to go more towards, when I have guests who are more the counter-narrative side, taking them seriously because he takes everyone seriously and talking about it for hours rather than minutes, as he mentions. And this is all Douglas Murray's point is. It's maybe have a think about that. It's honestly, it's the classic Spider-Man thing. With great power comes great responsibility, and I feel like you're shirking your responsibility a bit and think you should be doing better. That's all he's really saying here. And the online right have gone nuts, which I find really funny. And, they largely agree with Dave Smith, which we'll get into soon.
But why do you think that is? Just out of interest. I'm just interested in your selection of guests because you're like the world's number one podcast.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think about it that way. I just think I'd like to talk to this person.
And yeah, that's what makes the show popular. And what Douglas Murray's about to go into, that's not his issue.
If you're going to interview historians of the conflict or historians in general, why would you get somebody like Ian Carroll or? Yeah,
but Ian Carroll, I didn't bring him on for that purpose. I brought him on because I want to find out, like, how does one get involved in the whole conspiracy theory business? Because his whole thing is just conspiracies.
Sure.
Which isn't an unreasonable defence. But Douglas Murray's problem is that, yeah, you might get him on for this reason, but then effectively it turns into a propaganda show for Liam Carroll and his opinions, which, that's what's going to happen in conversations like that. So perhaps it's a good idea to get people on to counter that. And Joe Rogan's done that by getting Douglas Murray on here. He is actually doing it. It's just, over the recent months, he's not maybe done it as much as Douglas Murray would like. And I've not kept a close eye on it. But I have seen some ridiculous, and we'll get into them, some ridiculous Joe Rogan clips that I kind of can't believe were let fly. But I know Joe Rogan well enough at this point to know that he's not there to directly push back on things like that. He'll get Jamie to pull something up and they'll go through it. The problem is that there's a lot of misinformation on the internet. So sourcing something from the internet, I do it all the time. It's not necessarily bad. It's just you have to get well-rounded on these things. And the Joe Rogan Experience is not the place to do that with serious issues. But this is the problem. Some of these conversations are turning very serious, and it's not always made clear that it's, well, frankly, not a serious show when those conversations come up. And either way, millions of listeners a week, even if it's not serious, it's still important.
There's been a tilt in the conversation, both conversations, in the last couple of years. And it's largely to do with people who have appointed themselves experts, who are not experts.
You mean like Ian? I don't think he appoints himself an expert in anything.
Who's that other dude who thinks he's an expert on Churchill?
Daryl Cooper does not think he's an expert.
In fact, I think it's everybody else is always calling him an expert, and he's like, I'm just a history.
Have you ever...
Very, very irritating defence. We'll go into Daryl Cooper clips soon. But as I said before, the point is, it doesn't really matter if he says he's an expert or not. If other people are saying he's an expert, he has the perception of being an expert to some people. And as much as they, oh no, I'm not an expert, you're going to ride on the idea that people do think you're an expert in something and they're taking what you say seriously. And if at that point you're not taking scrutiny seriously, you're going to have a big problem. And people do not go on the Joe Rogan Experience to be scrutinised unless it's one of these debates. The Joe Rogan Experience, unironically, is quite a safe place for people to just say what they want with not too much pushback, because it is a conversation at the end of the day. The problem is that, and I've seen this as well, when people go around sharing clips of the Joe Rogan Experience as if, here's, well, for this example, Daryl Cooper saying, Churchill was actually the bad guy in World War II. People are going to hear that. Certain sections of the online right are going to take that seriously, and frankly, it gets you money. It does get you money, and this is the other issue. There are people desperate, absolutely desperate to push these counter-narratives, and they will throw money at anyone pushing a counter-narrative, which causes a really bad feedback loop where these people will just keep making asinine content, repeating discredited ahistorical nonsense from people like David Irving and things like that. You know, Holocaust denial, or oh, we're just questioning the Holocaust. Do you really believe it was 6 million? Yeah, I actually believe it was close to 7 million personally, but still, I'll take the 6 million number. But they'll hide behind this whole pathetic shield of, oh, I'm no expert, oh, I'm just asking questions. And when they get really scrutinised, they'll claim free speech and things like that. And you cannot be putting out content and not expect any pushback. And as far as I'm concerned, if these are your basic building blocks for your defence, you're not doing a very good job. I make it very clear where all my sources come from. I make it very clear that when I am talking about a subject, I will let you know where you can either do further reading or where I've sourced an awful lot of the facts, figures, and claims from, and you can go ahead and scrutinise all that if you wish. And hell, I've had people in the comments telling me where I'm wrong before, and I've adjusted and made corrections to my videos and future videos. Problem with the online writers is that they don't do that an awful lot from what I can tell, and instead they just prefer to make their own little hug boxes. And this is largely what's happened with people like Dave Smith and Daryl Cooper, and now Douglas Murray's come along saying, listen, you can't come along to these shows, put out all of this ahistorical asinine nonsense, and not expect me to do this. And then the defence is, well, he doesn't say he's an expert, other people do. Yeah, that's still really bad. If people are thinking he's some sort of expert and have this perception he's an expert and he's saying things that are dead wrong, then yeah, that's a problem and he needs to be scrutinised better. And that's what Douglas Murray's job here at the moment is, and he's doing well.
Absorbed any of his material? Have you ever consumed any of his podcasts or anything like that?
I've tried.
Yeah?
It's pretty hard to listen to somebody who says, I don't know what I'm talking about, but now I'm going to talk. Or I don't know about this, or I'm not capable of debating this historian, but I'm going to just tell you what I think.
Yeah, I really hate that too. You know, I've rarely talked about economics until I did about 2 years worth of reading into economics books. From a different perspective, it's not just like I read Austrian school stuff. You know, I read some Marxist stuff and it was largely impossible to read. I've looked into MMT, that also seems like a whole bunch of nonsense. And I'm pretty confident at this point I can talk about, well, economics. Same with certain periods of history. You're not going to see me making any sort of direct statement about Roman or Greek history. You're going to see me make a lot about British history, European history, to some extent American history as well, because that is the stuff that I know. And this is the problem. If you hear me say, I don't really know, I will make sure that you know. I will always preface what I'm about to say with, from what I understand, from my limited knowledge, X, Y, Z. If I'm wrong, I will always append as well. If I'm wrong, please correct me or let me know in the comments. Yeah, from what the clips I've seen of Daryl Cooper, he doesn't do that, and that is probably part of the reason why people think he's some sort of expert. But even then, if he does say before, oh, I can't debate a historian on it, yeah, that's a big red flag, and people should not take someone like that seriously.
Yeah, but that's not exactly what Daryl was saying. I mean, Daryl's point of view, however you feel about this, what Daryl's saying is he doesn't really like doing debates. He likes to do long format stuff where he can really explain his position.
If you throw a lot of shit out there, there's some point at which I'm just raising questions is not a valid thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I kind of hate that defence as well. Oh, Daryl doesn't like doing debates. Well, tough. You cannot put out your opinions like that, as Douglas Murray says, all this nonsense out, and expect that to be a valid defence. It's not a valid defence. That's a valid defence for some nobody on Twitter. That is not a valid defence for someone who does a multi-episode podcast where he talks about history. You are obviously going to have to come under scrutiny once you get popular enough, or if you go on a very popular platform to spread your nonsense as well. It's obviously going to happen. And, oh, he's not an expert is not a defence to that.
You're not raising questions. You're not asking questions. You're telling people something.
Do you think Daryl's doing that?
I think there's a whole bunch of guys doing that. I think Dave is doing that. Very obviously. Dave's a comedian, but he's now mainly talking about Israel.
And that's where that clip ends. And as far as I'm aware with Dave Smith from the clips I've seen, I would not have guessed he's a comedian from the Joe Rogan clips that I saw on Twitter of him. And this is the problem. People don't tend to listen to entire episodes of the Joe Rogan podcast, to be honest with you. They do listen to a lot of the clips. That's how I see a lot of these clips anyway. And then those people most interested will go towards them. And, just to make it clear, it's clips like this that you will see of Daryl Cooper. Let's listen to this. Because here is Daryl talking about the lead up to World War II.
And, it's like if there was a sliver of an opportunity to de-escalate that situation and bring it back down, if I'm the Emperor of America or Britain or whatever, I'm taking that chance. And if it turns out that Hitler's full of shit and he stabs us in the back first chance he gets, all right, then we'll have our war.
Is this
Yeah, the thing is that this is exactly what happened, though. Hitler took over areas of Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland, and Britain and France issued warnings. Listen, we've got guarantees on Poland. Do not touch Poland or there will be war. Hitler invaded Poland. He stabbed them in the back. This is exactly what happened. And here's Daryl Cooper trying to make out, just appease a little bit more. We could have avoided an entire war. You can't avoid this contract of safety guarantees for Poland, especially when the Germans are bombing civilians in Warsaw. It's just not going to happen. And it's this type of talk that leads people directly to say things like, at least we're not speaking German isn't a reason to have got into World War II. It's just ridiculous. These nationalists are saying that one of the main cultural touchstones of Britain, that is, we all speak English, doesn't matter. And it all stems from nonsense like this. I'm just offering a counter-narrative. Yeah, well, it's total nonsense. And I can see why Douglas Murray wants someone on to basically have a go at Daryl, because this is asinine.
Should we decide to stop something in its tracks at whatever cost of life? Because ultimately that is the right thing to do, because we're witnessing the genocide of people.
Yeah, so Joe Rogan asks, is this before or after the Holocaust? And the thing is that the Holocaust was quite a late Nazi policy. At first, the concentration camps were either slave labour camps or POW camps, or if you were particularly unlucky, you were obviously used for experiments, I guess is the best way to put it. POW camps were pretty horrific. Auschwitz was originally a POW camp and then turned into a concentration camp for Jews and then some gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, etc., but mostly for Jews, obviously. And some small-scale intel managed to get back to Britain in, I think it was 1942, of small-scale exterminations. At first it was bullets, but that was relatively slow compared to, obviously, what they turned into, which was gas chambers and crematoriums. And they were burning them outside before they had the crematorium as well. And it was pictures like that got back to British intelligence, but they largely did not actually carry on the war, frankly, to save Jews. That was kind of a post-war, my God, I can't believe how evil they were. As far as people were aware, Kristallnacht and putting Jews to slave labour was the worst the Nazis did, and then when it turned out they were exterminating them, that's when you end up with the devil being replaced with Hitler. Kind of makes sense in a way. But what's Daryl's response to, was this before or after the Holocaust?
Right, so what we were talking about and all of the points I was bringing up on Tucker were all from before that. In fact, they were from a full year before the German invasion of the Soviet Union. That was June 1941.
Yeah, pretty incredible. So this was after Germany invaded Poland, but before he broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Yeah, this was a period known as the Phony War because, effectively, Germany had massively rearmed and were quite focused on expanding their empire. Plus you had the Maginot Line in France. And so effectively throughout this time, plans were being put together to actually try and invade Germany and put an end to the war. But they never came about before, obviously, he invaded Poland. Before he invaded the Soviet Union, sorry. And so this makes the first clip even stupider. Why would you try and appease Germany here? You're already at war trying to get him out of Poland because you had security guarantees for them. This is what I mean by ahistorical nonsense. His narrative doesn't make sense.
And that's where most of the Jews lived. They're in. So if if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union, he never even would have had access to those people.
Well, in 1939, here's some population tables for you. So nearly 5 million of them lived in the USA. A lot of them moved to the USA because the rise of the Nazis obviously made a lot of European Jews quite sceptical of their safety in Europe, let's say. So a lot of them moved over there. Obviously, the next highest is, it's Poland, that place he already invaded. Amazing. Over 3 million of them. The USSR, which is over 100 times larger, probably way more than that, the size of Poland, it's just over 3 million. Not as many as Poland, though. No, here's the thing. Holocaust would never have happened. The vast majority of the Holocaust affected Polish, Hungarian, and other Jews in Eastern Europe, which is where a whole load of them were. Trying to claim that the Holocaust wouldn't have even happened if Hitler didn't try and invade Russia is absolutely incredible. Also, I don't see what Western powers doing anything would have to do with Hitler breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invading Russia. What the hell are you talking about, Daryl? Yeah, I can see why Douglas Murray got pretty annoyed at Daryl, because this is some absolutely asinine and moronic takes on the events of World War II. Oh, he doesn't say he's an expert. Well, he shouldn't. This is not how we should be talking then. And I'm not being funny, but Joe Rogan should at least have some basic understanding of World War II here. He should get Jamie to bring up a timeline of what happened in World War II, because that easily debunks most of this. Hell, get Jewish populations around the world. I just got one. Why couldn't they?
Now, Hitler didn't like the Soviet Union, all the way back in Mein Kampf and everywhere else. I mean, it was central to his ideology that communism, socialism were the enemy and everything. He may have invaded the Soviet Union someday and gone after all the Jews when he did.
So you just contradicted yourself. What the hell are you talking about? But again, it's a weird thing to be talking about. The justification for World War II and the reason for carrying on the war had very little to do with saving Jews. Again, they didn't really know the extent of the Holocaust until, obviously, they heard it from the Soviets, quite frankly. We're talking about Western powers here. It was the Soviets who were liberating the worst of the death camps, Auschwitz, Dachau, etc., and Western intelligence obviously had some inkling that exterminations were going on, but they had no idea it was 6 million at the time. No idea. So it's a really weird conversation to even have. Oh, why would you not have total war against someone killing Jews? Well, that wasn't the justification for total war. The justification for total war was Germany started total war. They need to be completely and utterly beaten, which is what happened.
When did Hitler start going after the Jews?
If you take him at his word in Mein Kampf, which is, it's a piece of political propaganda, that he wrote as a sort of a politician in Germany in 1924. And so you have to take it with sort of a grain of salt.
I don't know what the hell he means by any of that. Volume 2 was where all the politics was. He did an entire volume on his autobiography, effectively. This is why I think what I think. And I'm not being funny. It's a really boring read. I've read a few chapters of it. It is quite dry. Then again, it has been translated from German. But I don't know what he means by take it with a pinch of salt. What do you mean? No, I'm going to believe that this was Hitler's true thoughts, feelings, and policy. I don't know what the hell he means by take it with a pinch of salt. Also, weirdly, I don't know why he'd say, he did it as a politician. He did it as a prisoner of treason because he tried to commit a coup in Germany. Kind of a really large thing to miss out here. Again, this is why Douglas Murray has massive issues with Daryl Cooper here. He really is. He's got the tone of someone who knows what he's talking about, but actually going through the facts so far, he doesn't seem to know a damn thing. And he runs a history podcast.
But it's also one of the few sources we have, given his audience at the time, he probably didn't have a lot of reason to make this part up.
Take it with a pinch of salt, okay? He probably didn't actually have a lot of reason to make any of this up. So don't take it with a pinch of salt. What the hell are you talking about, Daryl? His audience at the time? His audience were people in the Nazi party already. Yeah, I get it. But also, the man had years in jail to write his book. And I'm not being funny, but early 20th century prisons weren't a great place. He probably would have been further radicalised in there too. Anyway, what's the point of all this?
Is that he had been from small town Germany, right? And
yeah, I'm really starting to see why Douglas Murray finds him really hard to listen to. So yeah, he was born in a small border town in Austria. That is true. At the age of 3, he moved to Passau in Lower Bavaria, which isn't too far away from the town, to be fair. However, it's a city, and he moved there because his father was promoted to customs administration within the civil service. Then at the age of 15, they moved back to Austria, to a commuter town to Austria's capital. This is not the type of person who grew up in small town Germany. It was a literal city he grew up in. And it's also where he got his German dialect rather than Austrian dialect, but either way. These are basic things that, again, all you have to do is get Jamie to pull this up, and it makes Daryl look like an idiot. He's got a lot wrong here. And people getting this much wrong about the 20th century's most documented man, yeah, it probably should start raising questions.
He was from a middle-class family. His father was a civil servant, respectable people, and nationalism back then was very much like a middle-class ideology.
Oh, finally, he gets stuff right. Let's just skip to the important stuff. When did Hitler start going after the Jews, do you reckon?
And Hitler really didn't grow up with any really even knowledge of the Jews. He says his father, he never heard him say the word. And, if they had any in the small town that he lived in, like, they were apparently well assimilated because he didn't know about them. And so then he moves to Vienna when he's a young adult, and there's a lot of Jews in Vienna.
Right, you can get these details right, but it's pretty amazing he gets other really major details wrong. But anyway, at least he's getting something right here. And to be fair, he does get Hitler's early life in Vienna correct, mostly correct, so we can skip all that. Yep, Hitler was bottom of the bottom, he couldn't get into art school, was already quite the German nationalist, having grown up in middle-class Germany or Bavaria. Yep, fine, good.
And then he says, and this is the way he relates it, he says it was actually the key that unlocked everything else for him, is that, he would say he realized, we could say he came to believe, that yes, these German masses, they are in a sorry state right now, but the reason for that is that they're being manipulated by the Jews.
Well, I suppose at the very least here we can say that Daryl does accept that Hitler was, yes, indeed an anti-Semite.
He had a lot of the same explanations and reasons you would hear from any anti-Semite then or now, banking and whatever. Like, all those things were, like, in there.
Yeah, like most German people, it just seems to be cultural. I mean, I'm not being funny. From the Nietzsche I've read, even Nietzsche just says, yeah, the Germans are just naturally anti-Semitic. So it's no surprise that German nationalist Hitler was also anti-Semitic and came to be anti-Semitic, despite his upbringing largely not involving anti-Semitism. Anyway, another clip from the Daryl Cooper podcast has, these claims about Hitler and his public anti-Semitism when he was within the Nazi Party.
Yeah, and it's important to know, too, that it's not like Hitler was going and giving big speeches at City Square in Berlin, going on and on and on about how we're going to kill the Jews. And the German people said, right on, like, let's go do it. That was...
kind of. It's true that he wasn't saying that he wanted to kill the Jews, obviously, when he was leader of the Nazi Party before they actually got power. As I say, the final solution was more of a middle-of-the-war idea. Obviously, you had the Madagascar plan, which I kept being told that was kept secret from everyone. It's literally the first thing they told you at Auschwitz when you do the tour there, so that's not hidden from anyone. The original idea was to deport the Jews when they got into power, but even before that, part of their 25-point programme, literally point 4, by the way, is none but members of the nation may be citizens of the state, and that means none but those with German blood, whatever their creed, may be members of the nation, no Jew, therefore may be a member of the nation. Yet the problem I have with this is that, okay, he wasn't going around saying, kill the Jews, that bit's true, sure, but are you going to mention that there was anti-Semitism in a lot of his speeches? There was anti-Semitism pretty blatantly in the Nazi Party, to the point where other parties would specifically put forward Jewish candidates to effectively try and humiliate Nazis when they got beaten in elections. You're going to mention that.
Like the speeches that are out there where he is talking about the Jewish question, like almost all of those are like internal Nazi party, like rally speeches, they're not him. He had to be careful about that. Like in 1938, which is pretty far down the line, when Kristallnacht happened, it was kind of a nationwide pogrom against the Jews in Germany that was launched primarily by Goebbels, the propaganda minister. But there was outrage in the German cities. People in Berlin, a lot of the places were outraged by what was going on, and Hitler had to actually get on the phone with Goebbels and say, cut this shit out.
Yeah, I can't find any source on this claim that Hitler told Goebbels to effectively stop further pogroms. In fact, I'm finding more sources that Hitler actually was tacitly agreeing with it, I think it's best to say. Hitler effectively just didn't mention Kristallnacht at all. He didn't try and disavow it. He didn't say if it was good or bad in public. He just ignored it. Literally the day after, he was making speeches and just not even mentioning it. And it was this Germany-wide event that obviously got into international news that really showed everyone in the world the extent to which anti-Semitism had perforated to become acceptable in Germany. But again, it wasn't a large reason to start the war. The reason to start the war was because they invaded Poland. It was more geopolitical than for the protection of Jews. But this idea that Hitler in some way wasn't a perpetrator of all this, I mean, if he didn't want it, why wouldn't he do anything about it? You know, no one from the Hitler Youth was punished for this. Goebbels kept his job and his position in the Nazi Party. Hitler just ignored all bad press about it. He just carried on with his plan and carried on with his government. The problem with this is that what Daryl's trying to do here is effectively try and say, he's not even trying to say Hitler was free from blame for anti-Semitism, but he is trying to say, when things got really bad, Hitler was actually on the side of, don't do this. And to be fair to him, he is saying that it's more to win political power and that he has to hide it. But the idea that there's nuance behind Hitler's anti-Semitism or German anti-Semitism at the time is quite ridiculous. And he directly says this, by the way.
Obviously, but because this is bad propaganda, people are not going for this. And that was the year before the war started, And so these are just nuances that, that become pretty obvious when you just remind yourself that you're just talking about people.
What nuances are you talking about? No, an awful lot of people joined the Nazi Party, yes, because of the whole Jewish thing. And yes, there was a Jewish sect of that Nazi Party, believe it or not. Pretty much everyone involved ended up in a concentration camp. But it's like, we're just talking about people and people make mistakes. It's like, no, this is pretty evil, and Hitler not doing anything about this is evil. In fact, I think it's more evil if it's true what he claims, that, Hitler told them, stop doing Kristallnacht because it's bad propaganda. I'd say that's even worse. That's way worse, because that's Hitler effectively saying, I'd be alright with it if it didn't cost us politically. That's effectively what he's saying, which is obviously evil.
They're just people. I mean, the Germans were a sophisticated, advanced political and cultural, place. They didn't suddenly turn into demons for 12 years and then go back to being the nice, normal Germans that we know now. Like, these things happened the same way every other historical event, ends up happening.
Sorry, but you can't. Kristallnacht happens, and all of a sudden it's this whole implication that the Germans weren't uniquely evil at this time. Yeah, I'm afraid they were. And the lesson you're supposed to learn from World War II is that actually, this evil can come out. It can come out in multiple ways, via snake oil salesmen or through nonsense like this. Like, it's a good thing that the Germans are ashamed of this time period, obviously. Even the AfD say that it is a small yet particularly evil part of their history. But the idea that it was just some sort of hiccup that could happen anywhere is pretty absurd. No, Kristallnacht is a pretty uniquely German phenomenon. Because even as Nietzsche says, there is a particular anti-Semitic streak throughout the German people, and obviously it took Nazism to basically try and rid themselves of that. So I can see why Douglas Murray was pretty annoyed about these clips, because they are just absurd. Honestly, he's talking like an expert, like he knows what he's talking about here. So again, of course, you are going to have criticism that treats you as such, and just saying, well, he's no expert, though. It's not good enough. He runs a history podcast. You are going to come under the same scrutiny as The Rest is History, which is run by two proper historians. Because at the end of the day, if you're throwing out information, even with the caveat of, I'm no expert, you're of course going to get criticism for it. I never, ever say to people who criticise me, don't take that claim that I made too seriously. At the end of the day, I'm just a lowly guy who runs a YouTube channel. That is never what I say when I make claims. I either say, I'll look into it, thank you for letting me know, or you're wrong, here's why I think you're wrong. Or on the very odd occasion, I'll say, don't take that too seriously, it was just a joke, I thought I delivered it like a joke. So it's ridiculous to try and use the claim of, he's no expert, he's just a comedian, he's just some guy who runs a podcast. Doesn't matter. We are in an age where it is easier than ever to be just some guy who runs a podcast. You know, it's not like running a local radio station anymore. You can get very popular by spreading misinformation, and that stuff needs to be stamped out. But the crazy thing I find is the amount of people that are trying to dismiss Douglas Murray as some, as I say, progressive leftist, because he's coming out with, frankly, decent points. And this is one clip that's used as an example.
Exactly, get your point. Like, there was lots of pushback. If you're saying he should go and debate somebody who's giving him pushback on that, okay, maybe.
Almost certainly. I think it's ridiculous to expect to make claims and statements on the internet, even if they're right or wrong, and expect no pushback. I don't know why anybody would expect differently.
I also think it's reasonable for him to say, I don't really do debates.
Yeah, I think it's weird to mainstream very fringe views constantly and not give another side. I think that's weird.
Yeah, I have personal experience in circles like this where fringe views started to be brought on to shows quite regularly in the online right, and now effectively audience capture has happened because non-stop super chats kept being sent through, and it's just made a nasty and vindictive hug box for people to effectively have these fringe views pushed non-stop. And as we've gone down the line and Elon's brought Twitter, they've all been quite pushed to the forefront. That's been quite obvious for some time, and now obviously people like Douglas Murray are noticing and saying, yeah, this has to go. This does not represent the right and should never represent the right, because effectively we've seen where apology for this sort of thing gets you, and it's nowhere good. And I am totally on board with that. And I frankly think that the excuses against Douglas Murray here have been pathetic.
I think there are very fringe views that have become mainstreamed on the right.
But then aren't they not fringe by definition?
Sure, you can play an epistemological game.
No, I'm just saying let's be accurate.
But you do understand the concept, don't you?
That fringe ideas become mainstreamed? Yeah. Okay,
right.
Sure.
So that's it.
Yeah, and it's not just the Doral Cooper Hitler things, which to be honest with you, they're not the worst things in the world. However, again, the thing is that Douglas Murray is quite aware, and I know that he personally knows people who've gone through this. He starts off with this whole I'm just questioning narratives bro thing, do it for a few years, and then end up in spaces that are just mental. And as I say, I know circles in the online right that have gone down this route as well. And this whole thing of, oh, Douglas Murray's saying to get experts on, I don't need to get clips of it people have seen, but this whole thing of you have to be an expert to talk about it, it's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that if you are brought onto podcasts like especially the Joe Rogan Experience, and you are making silly claims, you're obviously going to get pushback. And if Joe Rogan is only bringing on people making these silly claims, it's going to effectively bring in the wrong audience, turn a lot of other people off, and in fact it's going to actively misinform people on, say, events of the past or events of the current day as well. And perhaps getting Douglas Murray on is the first step toward effectively getting people on who know what they're talking about to counteract these ridiculous narratives on the right, because there's an awful lot of horseshoe theory going on, obviously not with the Hitler stuff, but I mean with like Russia-Ukraine and with, of course, Gaza Israel, because Douglas Murray is a journalist who actually goes to these places and reports on what he sees and talks with professionals on the issue, and not only that, talks to actually people who are fighting these wars as well. Way more journalism than most other people who are involved in the conflict and talk about it on the Joe Rogan podcast, and well, that's why you end up with clips like this.
So I think they disengaged in order to kill the peace process. I think they put the full blockade around the country for the reason that they've always kind of done it there, that, yeah, they don't want too much stuff getting in. They want to keep them, as they put it, on a diet, and they don't want rockets to fly into Israel.
The second one is a kind of important one, isn't it? The final
one
you said.
It is.
Yeah, so I'm not going to go through this entire clip, but to sum it up, Dave Smith talks about the blockade onto Gaza, obviously ignoring the fact that Egypt has a blockade on Gaza as well, because it's full of people they don't want in the country and don't particularly want to trade with, because frankly they're full of, and in fact run by, terrorists basically. And yes, they literally dig up water pipes to turn them into ammunition. That is stuff we have seen, and this is why there's a blockade, to not give them ammunition. You know, they'll trade in food and things like that. But it's this whole, oh, it's an open air prison, concentration camp, and terrible. Obviously, Douglas Murray points out, well, the population's increasing massively, which isn't typically what happens in concentration camps. Obviously brings up Auschwitz, which for some reason they say, oh, well, we're not saying it's a death camp. It's like, well, it was a concentration camp before it became a death camp, but at least they think that Auschwitz is too far, I suppose. And effectively the whole conversation on whether Gaza is being disproportionately blockaded by, again, Israel is the main conversation here, but also by, say, Egypt, ends up with this being said.
No, there was no deficit of goods coming in. I've been plenty of
times. There was no deficit?
No, there are
no goods were kept out.
There are plenty. How many? Have you been to the crossing points?
No.
When were you last there at all?
I've never been.
You've never been?
It's such a perfect moment. It's this whole problem that an awful lot of the left wing have, but an awful lot of the right wing have as well, where effectively, and they do talk about this, how, yeah, experts, especially leftist experts, have been caught with their trousers down, especially on things like, say, COVID, how it turned out that it came out from a lab rather than, obviously, the wet markets where people ate bat heads and things like that. And Douglas Murray even shows sympathy for this, and this is why he says you don't have to be an expert, but at the very least, have your position scrutinised by someone who is at least somewhat of an expert in the field. They might be a leftist, and if they're a leftist and an expert, well, you should have an easy time debunking them. But the thing is that if you are going to start talking about something, it's probably a good idea to be read up on the whole thing. And if you are saying things that are directly contradictory to what people are saying who have actually been there, like Douglas Murray here, and then you've never been, when you can go there, yeah, it's all a bit odd. And you can say he's got better things to do. Well, if he's got better things to do, maybe he shouldn't be talking about the thing that he wants to dedicate most of his time to talk about. I don't know about most, but a good portion of his time to talk about. There's a reason why my channel pivoted from talking about European politics, American politics, and British politics to mainly British politics. It's because I'm here. It's because I've been to these places. It's because, believe it or not, I'm an expert in being British. And whenever I bring up foreign politics, it's always within the remit of here's how it affects Britain, because I understand that better than anything. And what's part of the reason I did that is because, frankly, one of my brother's friends, who's a bit left-wing, obviously, he made the point that while you can talk about foreign countries and, you can say, I like the idea of these other foreign countries, actually going there is probably the best way to actually experience that. And I realised, he's actually kind of right there. I don't necessarily have to go there to talk about it, as Dave gets into, sorry. However, I'm obviously more of an expert on things going on geopolitically affecting Britain, is much more within my remit than, say, I know exactly what it's like to be in Australia. The best I can say with, say, Australia is I have friends that have moved there and they tell me about their anecdotes there. That's not necessarily going to be the experience for everyone, or they might even be an exception to the rule. I have plenty of American friends, which is why whenever I bring up America, I always remit to them. Don the Pleb, here's what he says about America. He's worth listening to. Here's a repeat of his point. When it comes to Britain, I'm giving you a lot of first-hand experience. And this is exactly what Douglas Murray is saying. Here's my first-hand experience. Here's what other journalists who have been there say. You are saying something that does not reflect reality, and you've not even bothered to go.
Well, am I not allowed to talk about it now? Have you ever been to Nazi Germany? Are you allowed to have feelings about them?
You can't time travel, but you can.
Right.
But you can travel.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's a fair point back. It's quite funny because there are plenty of YouTubers whose whole YouTube channel is just going to places that are in the news and getting on the ground, not quite live, but raw reporting, we'll say. The biggest cost of this is going to be the plane ticket to Israel, and yeah, he's not bothered to go. But as Douglas Murray says, he's fine to mouth off about it for hours on end on podcasts. This is a large reason why I don't go into foreign wars too often. One, you can't really know what's going on because of all the propaganda from both sides, and two, yeah, getting there would be slightly difficult. But as Douglas Murray mentions, you can actually go to Israel and see this crossing and see how much what you've been trolled's true. But he won't do it, and he'll counter-signal people who have been there like Douglas Murray. It's nuts.
Hey, but so what? So what's the point?
I find that
lots of people have been there and agree with me, and lots of people have been there and agree with you.
Yeah, but
so
if
I don't
you're
know
going to
what
spend a year and a half talking about a place, you should at least do the courtesy of visiting it.
All right.
And that's pretty much this whole conversation in a nutshell, to be honest. Douglas Murray, listen, you're talking about something. You should probably at least do the basic courtesy of reading into it properly, and also, of course, if you can, visit the damn place. I mean, I'm not being funny. If I ever became a mainstream journalist and started talking about foreign places, I'd kind of expect myself to have to go there. And it's obviously a completely reasonable position to say, if you can go somewhere and don't and talk about it all the time, that's not going to make your input on the conversation particularly useful. And it is quite odd to go on about it and not actually visit the place, and especially not to have proper scrutiny of your positions, especially if you're on one of the most popular podcasts in the world. Anyway, they then get on to the whole Daryl Cooper issue.
He also said on here that he wasn't anti-Semitic until the Holocaust. There were no speeches of Hitler's in the 1930s.
No, again, this is
No.
Listen,
No, he said he was not public about it.
He said he was downplaying it to win over. He said there was a period where he was downplaying it to win over popular support in Germany. It was his argument.
There is no historian of World War II who thinks that Hitler was downplaying anti-Semitism in the 1930s. That was what he was doing.
Yeah, they're kind of both right here. Hitler's whole shtick with downplaying his anti-Semitism, realistically what it actually was with certain speeches and with certain audiences, yes, he'd downplay what he truly believed, but, I mean, for God's sake, point 4 of the National Socialist 25-point plan is no Jew can be a German citizen. Hell, they were encouraging Jews to leave Germany of their own volition, and those that weren't, they then ended up having the Madagascar plan. Like, it was pretty obvious that there was a lot of anti-Semitism that he didn't even need to necessarily dog whistle. It was in the literal plans. This whole idea that Hitler was underplaying his own anti-Semitism to the German people, it's kind of true to certain audiences, but it's not completely true. His first speech after becoming German Führer in 1939 at the Reichstag, it culminated with him effectively saying, if there's another world war, we'll annihilate the Jews in Europe. Again, you don't dog whistle and then get to that. Unfortunately, all the speeches are quite hard to come by on the internet. But again, even before that, you had Kristallnacht with the Hitler Youth going around smashing up windows, burning down synagogues, and some people dying, of course, in that as well. How do you end up with a pogrom and at the same time try and say, yeah, it was all just dog whistled? That doesn't make any sense.
He wrote a book about it in the 1920s. He got to power on it, and he grew his power on the back of it. The idea that you can argue that in the 1930s, Adolf Hitler was downplaying the anti-Semitism, there's no historian who would agree with that. So why would you throw out the idea that in the 1930s, Hitler was not being anti-Semitic in public? That was what he was doing in public. He announces to the German parliament what he wants to do.
Yep, just been through it. Does not say that Kristallnacht was bad or anything like that. In fact, just ignores the whole damn thing. The Hitler Youth, that kind of represents him. They were the vanguard in Kristallnacht. No one gets punished for it. Again, it's pretty ridiculous to say he was downplaying anti-Semitism. Completely ridiculous, in fact.
So when you're throwing out claims like he was keeping it down in the 1930s, first of all, what are you doing? And secondly, why?
Okay. I mean, I think that it's kind of hard because I don't even know exactly what Daryl's point on that was, and so I'm not really in a position to argue what he was saying there.
Yeah, I mean, we've just gone through it as well, and I have no idea what his point was. There was more nuance to the Nazis and anti-Semitism. I don't think that's the argument you want to be making, Daryl, but you've certainly made it. And Douglas Murray goes into more detail as to why this is a problem.
I would suggest that one of the things that is going on at the moment is, despite, or maybe because of what you just described, there are movements now on the right in America, subcultures, including people who follow both of you, who are very interested in playing with this absolute beyond the pale thing. Why somebody like Jake Shields wants to play around with Holocaust denial.
Yeah, it's something that has certainly simmered up from the lower dregs of the internet, we'll say. I've seen it happen firsthand, for God's sake. In Britain, we're pretty good at keeping a lid on it because, a lot of our men died in World War II against the Nazis, so being pro-Nazi in any way is seen as basically treacherous to the UK. And trying to undermine Churchill as a leader, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, he's human, he wasn't perfect. He did get us out of a pretty existential crisis, though, in that we would have been annihilated if we lost World War II.
Why?
I can't answer for Jake Shields. I don't know.
Why do you
no
think?
Idea. I have no idea. I think
I'm telling
a
you,
lot of people get captured by audience capture.
captured by their audience.
Yeah.
Yep, that's definitely true. And then the question is, well, what is this audience after? All right, the I don't think it's a very good defence to say that. I think that people who are, the centre of an audience should be, to some extent, stopping their audience from being idiots. But obviously, this Jake Shields character, who I see his tweets from every now and then, and yet there is Holocaust denial there. Why is he doing it? I don't know. And Douglas Murray's whole issue here is, why aren't you more disgusted by it? It's a bad thing, and it's something that we should kick out of the right, obviously.
Michael Malice had that great line. He goes, when you take the red pill, you're supposed to take one and not swallow the whole bottle. Yes. This is a real danger when the establishment and the institutions are all caught with their pants down, having sold a bunch of very consequential policies based on lies. And then once people realize that, they go, well, what else have they been lying to me about?
Yeah, and I keep having to tell people this amazingly, but a lot of the time, the only way that the mainstream media and elite manage to hold their power is if they actually do tell the truth more often than not. The problem around the COVID period is that they were frankly lying too much to us. That's why they've lost an awful lot of their influence post-COVID. And what's actually ended up happening is that a lot of normies are basically trying to forget that whole time period. And because of that, trust isn't being annihilated in them like it probably should have been. However, when it comes to kind of post-COVID, they're trying to tell the truth quite a bit more. But the thing is, if you're saying they lied about COVID, therefore they've been lying for a century about what happened in Germany in 1940-odd, then yeah, you've done as Michael Malice said. You've not taken just the red pill, you've taken the entire bottle, and it's made you look absolutely moronic. And you've effectively turned into a reverse NPC, where an NPC obviously will take establishment talking points at face value and repeat them. Your anti-NPC will take your establishment talking points and effectively go directly against it, because apparently you can't trust a damn word they're saying. And at that point, you're just barking at headlines. And the thing is that this isn't just some fringe view. You've got podcasters. Jake Shields is already a popular guy, but you've got entire podcasters, and even quite popular ones, who just come out and say stuff like this. Because that number is greatly over-exaggerated, it leads people to question if that event even happened at all. Douglas Murray is to blame for the Holocaust denial than anyone doing basic arithmetic. It's just nuts, and it is very much crazy to me that, because I've been through this whole, let's see what Holocaust revisionists, let's call them, have to say about the whole thing. You go into any depth on any of their claims, and it's all just nonsense. Oh, it was for delousing. Why'd they need 4 chambers then? Oh, it was for showers. Why were the shower heads fake? Oh, they used wooden doors. Why were they gas tight? Why was, I think it was Goering, why was he writing in his diary that they were killing Jews like rats? And then in the end it's like, oh, the 6 million number's actually just, it's an estimate, sure. But when you get to industrial scale like that, and a lot of the records by the Nazis get burned to try and hide the fact they did this, yeah, you end up in a situation where you have to estimate. And frankly, trying to deny it, I at this point just take it as either they're a complete grifter or a complete sociopath, and I've not seen an exception to that rule yet. So, yeah, this is the type of thing that Douglas Murray says. You need to stomp this stuff out, and he actually puts it perfectly in this clip.
This is the shtick of these guys. They've decided it's edgy and funny, and I think this is very, very interesting and also very dangerous, because we live in an era now that the right has got some mojo back in America. We saw years of crazy left overreach, where they tried to make us all say the craziest things. And completely predictably, there are now figures on the right playing with really dark and ugly stuff on their side.
I agree with
that.
that.
And they are mainstreaming
I don't
this,
think
and I
Daryl's
think it's
doing that.
partly being mainstreamed by the 2 people I just described. And both of you have kept speaking to these people, and you don't get on the historians who know about this.
Yeah, I think it's just perfectly valid criticism, and it's things that I have noticed in online circles in Britain for some time. Homeland effectively just try and avoid this entire shtick, and they try and avoid it because they had an issue in Patriotic Alternative where you had Mark Collette openly saying this.
Matt V said to all 3 of us, if you could only preserve one book for the future white generations, which one would you choose? I'll go first, because this is a real struggle for me. It's a real struggle of mine to choose a book. that I would like to preserve. Because on one hand, I would obviously like to pick my own, but on the other hand, that looks pretty sort of big-headed. I'd say out of all the books that I've read, there's 3 books. One by a certain misunderstood Austrian painter, that is rather marvelous. One by George Lincoln Rockwell, that if I probably say on this show, it'll be banned. And Dr. David Duke's My Awakening.
And it was at this point where I stuck my flag in saying, yeah, this is obviously too far and not something I'm even going to get close to talking about. And I, frankly, will have conversations with these people, but I will avoid them as best I can, because I do not want to be associated with people like this, because they are just... I don't feel like I'm going to learn an awful lot from them, I'll put it that way. And this was years ago when they were still fringe, and frankly now they are still very much fringe, and frankly deserve to stay at the fringes. And the only way they stay at the fringes is by the right wing keeping them at the fringes. The left wing aren't the ones that keep them at the fringes, it's the right wing. Just as the left wing failed to keep their fringes in the fringes, and, well, it ended up with the disaster we're in now. The thing you don't want to do is have the same thing happen, because if the same thing happens, well, you end up with the left winning again. But this whole conversation where it's like, oh, so you have to be an expert to talk about something, no, that is not Douglas Murray's point, and it's never been his point. His point is that if you are going to be speaking as if you are some sort of expert, you have to expect some sort of scrutiny. And frankly, an awful lot of the replies from Dave Smith and his followers, and everyone who turned out on his side in this debate, is effectively this.
I'm saying...
I'm not used to this level of scrutiny!
I can tell. Yes.
Yeah. And that's it. It's CoffeeZilla versus Boogie 2988, with Douglas Murray being CoffeeZilla and everyone else, well, everyone on Dave Smith's side being Boogie 2988. And they got into a whole conversation about Gaza and Israel, where once again, Douglas Murray, because he's a journalist, gone through all this, seen the horrors for himself as well, and talks to soldiers on the ground and people within the Israeli Defense Force. He knows what he's talking about. He's seen Gaza as well. And he is scrutinising Dave's position when it comes to the stuff he said about Israel and Gaza. And Douglas Murray just wipes the floor with him, as far as I can tell. Because Douglas Murray knows what he's talking about, as he knows what he's talking about when it comes to containing fringe elements of the right. Because the fact of the matter is that Douglas Murray wants solutions to our problems. You don't get that from people being edgy boys, throwing around the idea that the 6 million number's just too much. Oh, it's all a bit Hollywood. You know, the fact that you can't believe that the German people can commit industrial scale extermination over 4 years is pretty nuts. You know, there's been genocides in Africa of hundreds of thousands of people in about 40 days with machetes. You know, of course the Germans can commit industrial scale murder. I've been to the damn concentration camp in Auschwitz. I saw how they did it. And honestly, going there, it gives you a hell of a different perspective on it. It's one of those things that's hard to describe, but actually going to Auschwitz, it's made me a hell of a lot more angry at people who question the whole thing. And I think the reason is because it's not a particularly difficult place to get to. You're on holiday to Poland, you can get there. But these people will pretend that they know more about that than the people who've studied the history, people who've been there. You know, you might have one exception to the whole thing, David Irving. Well, he's discredited by pretty much everyone else who talks about it. So who am I going to believe here? And then it obviously gets onto the whole, oh, Churchill was actually terrible. Oh, why'd you care if you're speaking English? You know, you have problems that were caused in the 90s, for God's sake. That's all obviously Churchill's fault. It's so obvious what they're trying to do with all this, and it's just dishonest from people who pretend otherwise. So yeah, that's where I'm up to with it. Scorch earth on these people. The right needs to be sensible, and there is a lot of people who aren't being sensible on the right. Dave Smith apparently one of them, and people like Mike Cernovich and others who have sided against Douglas Murray being sensible here. Yeah, I wouldn't trust him. But anyway, with that, we've gone over an hour, and I think I've talked about this subject enough. So, that's everything I had for you for today. Tuesday, it's Tosh Talks. Do come along to that. I believe we're talking about Doge and USAID and how American soft power all worked, straight from some of the horses' mouths. Then it's Laughing at the Guardian on Thursday evening, as it's Holy Week, and that's the best day to do it. Videos out as and when I can make them. Right, now, when it comes to helping out the channel, you can subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment telling me what you think. I think there's going to be good debate on this video. And not only that, you can also give super chats and super thanks, and also become a channel member. Those are all great and direct ways to help the channel if you can afford it. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.